This guy's trying to kill me.
Who?
From a woman's worst nightmare.
You're pregnant.
Now things get really scary.
To a bold escape that turns into a wild chase.
A speed in excess of 100 miles an hour. Anything can go wrong.
A terrifying date night.
A couple enjoying a night out ends up stopping a masked and armed man.
Said call 911. No, I'm gonna help my husband.
And a shocking end to a burglary gone wrong. Jaw-dropping videos caught on camera.
Wait, what's wrong?
This guy's trying to kill me.
Who? You need police. Get in the car,
I'm lying to you.
What's wrong?
It's a chilling encounter caught on a dash cam.
A brazen car theft captured on camera.
Video shows the frightening moment a pregnant mother and her young son were forced from their car during rush hour traffic.
Here you see a motorist going down the highway.
I realized there were all these cars stopped when they shouldn't have been stopped. And I saw one car in particular with its four-ways on. Usually that means like there's a problem.
And as you notice right here, you see a man standing in the front of that car.
Do you need help?
I thought the gentleman was having a medical emergency.
We feel a lot of empathy when we think that someone is in distress. We become altruistic because we want someone to help us if we need help.
Do you need help? You need help?
Yes.
What's wrong?
Put me in the backseat. Go. This guy's trying to kill me.
Who?
When the man told me that somebody was trying to kill him, for a split second, I kind of believed him because he looked so distraught.
Put me in the backseat. Go.
Why, what's wrong?
This guy's trying to kill me.
And then I looked for the threat, but I didn't see any.
We don't know his mental state. However, sometimes people who are having a psychotic break, they may be paranoid that someone's out to get them. And they perceive real things in the environment as being threats.
This guy's trying to kill me.
Who?
I'm trying to call him a friend, this guy.
Who's trying to kill you? No. What's going on?
He attempts to open up Roxy's back door.
At this point, she does a great job of staying calm and locking her doors.
Wait, what's wrong?
I'm lying to you.
What's wrong?
She has to determine, is this a scam? Is this a carjacking? Or is this a person who is actually in danger?
I could see like how distraught he was on his face. So like, I really thought he needed medical attention.
Who's trying to kill you?
They're trying. See, look at.
Here, go in front of my car.
And that's when I realized this man needs help. So I'm gonna call 911.
Just wait, just sit down.
911. Please stay on the line.
He's not gonna kill you.
Your call will be answered by the next available 911 agent.
Roxanne does a great job in the situation. She inquires as to whether or not she can actually help before she jumps in and puts herself in harm's way.
Suddenly, another car pulls up.
Veuillez ne pas raccrocher.
I was concerned, but there were two young guys behind me and they were yelling to the red car, "Don't let him in, don't let him in."
Please stay on the line. Ottawa 911.
But this car is not locked, so the man gets inside and finds a pregnant woman and her 8-year-old son.
When he got into the passenger side, I was like, because his whole demeanor changed when he popped in. Like, he went from a vulnerable posture to like aggressive. So I just knew something bad was happening.
Now things get really scary.
This guy's trying to kill me.
Who?
I'm trying to call him.
Who's trying to kill you?
After claiming someone wants to murder him, the man forces his way into a car driven by a pregnant woman.
You need police.
He was like elbowing her into her stomach. She's 8-9 months pregnant.
In a panic, her young son jumps out of the car.
Get in the car. On Tremblay, there's a man assaulting somebody. He's trying to jack a car. Hey, get the out of the car.
After a few gut-wrenching moments,
He's stealing it right now.
the man forces the woman out of the car.
Yeah, because I'm pregnant. You're pregnant. Yeah.
Paramedics arrive and rush her to the hospital. Thankfully, she and the baby are okay. Roxy uploads the footage to her Facebook page, and it immediately goes viral.
The next day, I was on the news. Seen a lot of crimes happen in my life, unfortunately, but I've never seen that.
The dashcam footage of the harrowing ordeal is invaluable.
You could see his face really clear. And the cop loved that. He's like, we're gonna be able to submit a screenshot of this to our foot patrol officers and our cruisers, and they're gonna be able to ID him.
The next day, police discover the SUV ditched in a snowbank and arrest the man soon afterwards in a neighboring city. He's charged with possession of property obtained by crime and breaking and entering.
It's important to have a dash cam because it keeps everybody accountable. Video footage doesn't lie.
911, please stay on the line.
But while Roxanne needed the police, others go out of their way to avoid them. It's a wild chase that catches everyone by surprise.
This case begins when police officers are dispatched to a shoplifting.
I can't remember your name. Tell me again. Yes, Tasha.
The suspect, Tasha Sponsler, is accused of stealing cosmetics from a nearby store.
The 33-year-old is arrested, restrained, and placed in the back seat, while officers dig through her bag.
So as we're watching the body cam footage, law enforcement is going through her purse to see if they can locate the stolen goods.
It's a hot day, so in a routine move, they leave the car running.
Officers will leave the car idling because they want to leave the air conditioning on for whoever's inside the vehicle.
The officers are doing their paperwork. They're all standing around in the area.
But Tasha is up to something.
She's looking around. She's able to unclip the seatbelt while still handcuffed.
It appears that the officer did not secure the cuff tightly and did not secure the second lock on the cuff.
She's kind of pulling a Harry Houdini here. Once she realizes she's in the clear, she sees a window of opportunity. Literally.
She not only was able to get out of the handcuffs, but she was able to get through the cop car partition. It's only 12 inches wide. Who is Tasha? And what diet is she on?
Yeah, about that.
The situation is clearly escalated.
There are armed officers all around her, and that didn't stop her from stealing their car.
A dangerous high-speed chase is underway. And it's all caught on the stolen car's dash cam.
This chase lasts for 23 minutes, and almost half of it is at a speed in excess of 100 miles an hour. Anything can go wrong at any second.
In these pursuits, the public and innocent people are always at risk. Citizens do not know that this vehicle is being driven by a suspect. All they see is a patrol vehicle. The worst case scenario could be that this young lady could hit multiple pedestrians or kill herself.
What makes the situation even worse is during this chase, officers can see that the suspect is reaching for a shotgun that's locked inside the cruiser.
The shotguns that are mounted in patrol cars often takes only one button for it to be released.
As an officer, you have to be asking yourself, why is she doing all this? This was a simple shoplifting. Why has she escalated it to this point?
It looks like a video game type scenario because she's going off-road, she's going through spikes.
Eventually, officers realize that this suspect has no intention on stopping, so they have to use this highly, highly dangerous move.
An officer angles his vehicle to touch the suspect vehicle and actually turn the vehicle sideways in order for the suspect to lose control of this vehicle.
It's absolute chaos at this moment. The car is spinning. There's debris going everywhere.
Within seconds, Tasha is surrounded.
You just had your cruiser stolen, and now you're being faced with someone who may have a weapon on them. So your heart's beating, your adrenaline's pumping.
Cover, cover. I got cover.
Tasha offers no explanation for her desperate getaway attempt. But there is one hint.
Yeah, true. What you got? Yep.
All that for a little bit of dust.
She's hit with multiple charges, including aggravated assault, evading arrest, and unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. Police post the video online, and it instantly goes viral.
Slipped out of her handcuffs and, when they weren't looking, climbed into the driver's seat.
So they did post a video of the police chase to their Facebook page with the hashtag #FoolMeOnce, making light of the situation, but also showing that they're humans, they make mistakes, and they fixed it. They installed a screw in the partition that now only allows the window to open 4 inches.
They screwed that partition a little bit tighter, so no one is gonna Tasha again.
At Tasha's sentencing, the judge slams her with 45 years behind bars.
An Angelina County jury has found the woman accused of stealing a Lufkin Police Patrol unit guilty on all charges.
The harsh punishment sparks controversy.
Now, 45 years may seem extreme, but she put lives at risk. And 45 years is not only to serve as a form of rehabilitation, but also a deterrent for anybody else who might think about doing this in the future.
But sometimes criminals are stopped in their tracks before they even get started.
A couple enjoying a night out at a restaurant ends up stopping a masked and armed man.
It's 10 p.m. on a Saturday night at this chicken restaurant in Kentucky.
The masked gunman walks straight to the counter.
He says something to the cashier. She doesn't respond immediately. So he pulls out a gun.
The cashier is terrified. But what neither she or the masked gunman realize is that he couldn't have picked a worse place to rob.
No one is in the restaurant except one couple. What is unique about this couple? They are both off-duty officers.
Nicole and Chase McCowan work for the Elizabethtown Police Department.
You can see that the couple notices what's happening.
The couple quietly hatch a plan.
And I saw her hands go up like this. I'm like, do you feel what I think he's doing? And he's like, yeah. He passed the phone to me and he said, call 911. And I looked at it for a second and I'm like, no. I'm gonna help my husband.
Literally no question. We just looked at each other. Is this what's going on? Let's go.
Two off-duty officers have interrupted their date night to chase an armed robber.
Chase goes one way, and then Nicole goes the other. This actually disorients the suspect for a second.
The masked gunman drops his gun, runs out the door, but they are right behind him.
At that exact moment, a shocked customer is trying to walk inside.
And as you can see at the top of the screen, you have another patron coming into the store, clearly confused, but he's nice enough to hold the door for the police officers.
Outside the restaurant, Chase and Nicole continue their hot pursuit of the suspect on foot.
30-year-old Justin Carter was arrested in minutes, and they hold him until other officers are able to arrive. He's charged with robbery, possession of a firearm, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon.
Security video of the couple's date night heroics hits the news.
2 off-duty officers being called heroes. He was attempting to rob a restaurant.
They actually chased him and later stopped him right there.
The public is enamored with this crime-fighting duo.
Generally, when we go away from home, it's to be away from the job. We don't have to worry about seeing people we know, and this is how it turned out this time.
Law enforcement is never off-duty to the public, even when we are with our families.
And what are people most captivated by?
The officers were just married 6 months ago and had dinner at this same restaurant on their wedding night.
It's been an exciting 6 months.
Their date night may not have gone as planned, but the couple is honored for their bravery. And they get a gift certificate to a local steakhouse for another romantic night on the town.
This was absolutely an act of bravery. These officers saw someone who was in trouble, and they did what they were trained to do. What better bonding experience than to catch a criminal together? She's a keeper, Chase.
In this store in Canada, another criminal plummets to viral fame.
On first glance, this surveillance footage from this convenience store doesn't seem too outlandish, but upon further review, you see something weird going on at checkout.
They're trying to use a debit card, but the owner of the store believes it could be stolen. He calls the police.
The man and women are answering some questions. And in this moment, you see a game time decision from the man. He's using the woman as like a battering ram.
The owner is trying to help the police to keep these suspects in the store. The male suspect eventually sort of wrestles himself away. He then tries to run to the back of the store to get out, but the door is locked. And now he's just sort of like caged mice inside of the store.
This is the moment that I'm kind of still scratching my head over. The man tries to arm himself with snacks.
He grabs like a bag of candy or chips, ready to toss it at the officer. The police officer pulls out a taser.
So he's now in a face-off with the police, and I don't think anybody would be surprised of which one of those is gonna win.
The man ditches the chips and appears to give up.
These situations are always stressful. Someone could be playing possum where they want you to get closer to them, so they may present themselves as being compliant, but until they're actually in handcuffs, you never really know. In this case, the officer was right to be hesitant.
It's never a good idea to lunge at a police officer who's pointing a taser directly at you. You would think that this is when the female suspect would just give up, but no.
She sneaks to the back like he tried to do, only to find out that it's also a locked door. So when you can't go out, you go up.
She's gone, but the officer is so busy trying to handcuff her partner in crime, he's oblivious.
The officer has the male suspect on the ground. He breaks away again, runs to the door.
The officer takes a tumble, but only to get back up, cutting off the guy before he exits from the front door and ramming him pretty hard. And if you're wondering right now, where has the woman been through all of this?
This is one of the most wild videos I have ever seen. Climbing through a ceiling, falling through a ceiling, throwing candy at an officer. I mean, all of this is completely ridiculous.
By this point, backup is arriving, and it's become this entire madhouse in the store. And thankfully, they are coming to escort this man and woman out.
Police identify the pair as Richard Pariseau and Brittany Burke. They are charged with a variety of crimes, including obstructing a peace officer and criminal mischief. A relieving end to a very unusual day.
The owner of the store actually got a certificate from the police for helping to detain them.
He can now frame that in this store that hopefully doesn't get any other visitors like them again.
Woman running up to the door of a house, pleading for help.
A terrifying kidnapping.
We don't know what's going to happen to her.
A young boy in grave danger.
He's making a scene, he's throwing rocks.
He's terrified.
Raiding the place of designer goods by the fistful.
Brazen high-end robberies.
Grab as many high-priced items as you can and go.
Right smack in the middle of the afternoon.
And a woman's bravery.
I was protecting a friend.
Comes with an unthinkable price.
And she is viciously attacked.
You will be found, you will be arrested, and you will face criminal prosecution.
Shocking crimes caught on camera. A woman runs for her life as a doorbell camera records.
An alleged kidnapping caught on camera.
This video is heartbreaking.
On a quiet suburban street in the dark early morning of New Year's Day, a terrifying scene unfolds.
This car pulls up and stops. A woman gets out and she starts running towards the door.
She's knocking on the door frantically, trying to get someone's attention. A male individual exits the same vehicle and approaches her.
She needs help.
She's got nowhere to go. She's terrified. You can hear it in her voice.
You clearly hear her say, "Stop, Darnell."
The woman seems to know her attacker, but who is he? And why is he doing this?
As a police officer, I've had many experiences where I've had footage like this. It never gets easier to look at it.
We don't know what he wants. We don't know what's going to happen to her.
No one hears her scream until hours later, when the homeowner discovers the disturbing footage on his Ring camera.
When he sees this video, he's probably traumatized. Someone feels incredibly helpless when they can't help someone who needs them, especially when they're literally at their doorstep begging for help.
Horrified, he immediately calls police.
If this is an abduction, you only have a small window to get her back. The more time that passes, the more dangerous the situation becomes for her.
This could be a case of trafficking. He could be someone who is exploiting her, who's abusing her.
Police share the video with the public.
Home surveillance showing a woman running up to the door of a house, pleading for help, attacked by a man and dragged away just seconds later.
What we are able to show you is still pretty disturbing, so a warning to our viewers.
Police are on the hunt right now for the woman and the kidnapper, asking for your help.
Officers received many tips. Fortunately, the footage is pretty clear. You can see both of the individuals' faces. It didn't take long for someone to realize who they were.
The next day, police are able to determine that the suspect's name is Darnell Rogers.
And it turns out this is no random act of violence.
Darnell Rogers is the partner of this victim and the father of her child.
What we later learned was they were at a New Year's Eve party together. There was alcohol involved, and on the way home, there was a verbal argument.
And she was afraid for her safety, so she decided to flee from that situation.
And that's what we caught on footage.
What's not caught on camera is perhaps the most shocking and disturbing part of this story.
Their baby was in the car while all this is happening.
This woman is so desperate to get away from her abusive partner, she leaves her baby behind in the car. The baby is unharmed. One day after the incident, Darnell Rogers is arrested. He pleads guilty to 1 count of coercion and 1 count of battery domestic violence.
These surveillance systems are so helpful for us in following up, in countering the crimes, to combat these violent crimes in nature.
But at sentencing, there's an unexpected twist. The victim pleads with the judge for leniency.
When you're traumatized and physically and emotionally broken down by your partner, the impacts are very complex. She's probably responding to the effects of that long-lasting trauma.
In court, she says, "I know what happened that night is not who he really is." And she says that if he goes to prison, the absence will take a toll on their daughter. The judge gives him 3 years probation.
It's hard to ignore a mother's pleas. It's hard to ignore a battered person's pleas. It's likely that he got leniency because she asked for it.
And this troubling video is an important reminder to anyone suffering in silence.
You know, this situation is horrible, and if you or someone out there you know is going through a similar situation where they're involved in domestic violence, do yourself and your family a favor and get out of it as soon as possible. If this person has done it once to you, they can do it again, and nobody deserves this.
It's also alarming when innocent children don't feel safe walking home alone. This video is a parent's worst nightmare, and it has millions of views. It all begins on a Thursday night in suburban Salt Lake City.
10-year-old Graydon is walking home from basketball practice just 2 doors down from his own house. He's walking along, he looks back, and this sedan with 2 or 3 guys pulls up next to him, telling him to get in the car. Clearly, Graydon has spidey sense. He knows something is wrong.
Graydon picks up his pace, but so does the car.
Who are these guys? What do they want with this 10-year-old boy?
The strangers in the car try to entice Graydon with candy.
It's something we've all grown up hearing. Don't take candy from strangers.
It's terrifying to think that there are still criminals out there trying to lure kids in with candy.
With his front door in view, Graydon races up the steps to get inside. But the door is locked.
He starts calling for his mom, which breaks your heart to hear, because your parents are the only people you think can save you. Hearing him scream like that for his mother, you clearly know he's terrified.
The white sedan is right at the edge of the family's property line.
Whoever is in that car is parked and waiting there for a reason, and you can see them there in the distance to the right of Graydon on the surveillance camera.
And just when you think it can't get worse, the car suddenly goes straight towards him.
Those lights come on, and here comes that car again. You wonder if someone's gonna jump out and grab Graydon.
But that's when this young boy bravely fights back.
He's making a scene, he's throwing rocks, not only for defense, but being as loud and rambunctious as possible.
It's clear that Graydon has been taught well by his parents about what to do in this situation. He's trying to alert anyone that there are strangers in this neighborhood and he needs help.
Now, Graydon sees his chance to escape.
He's a really smart kid, too, running straight to a neighbor's house for help.
Which is luckily unlocked. He runs in, locks the door behind him.
Graydon is safely inside, but the car doesn't leave. It pulls into another driveway and waits.
How fast can a child be abducted? In a matter of seconds? Minutes?
Whoever is in the car that has been following Graydon, they refuse to leave, even after he takes refuge in a neighbor's house.
Can you imagine if that neighbor's door was locked as well?
Then, after a few tense minutes, the car finally drives away. Graydon's parents are so horrified, they shared the doorbell video online and with the media.
Less than 200 feet. I mean, if kids can't walk 2 doors down at 6 o'clock at night, I mean, that's scary. Hopefully we can find him.
You know, he's a smart kid and he's a fighter.
This could have gone completely the opposite way. Graydon could have been abducted and Graydon's parents might have never seen him again. But luckily, he is safe.
Police still don't know who was in the car or why they targeted Graydon, and the case remains unsolved. But it's an eye-opener for all parents and their neighbors.
They're in their neighborhood. You never think the worst possible scenario on your street.
Luckily, in this situation, it seemed that Graydon had a good relationship, was able to rush into his neighbor's house. They were able to save him. If you see kids in your neighborhood, you gotta be able to help. And so it's important that you get to know them.
Having good neighbors can also be helpful when your business is targeted by criminals.
Grab as many high-priced items as you can and go.
This is broad daylight.
Everyone flees the store.
New York City has some of the world's most famous luxury stores.
This is high-end shopping. This is Balenciaga.
Too high-end for me.
And that makes them prime targets for criminals. Here, a seemingly innocent customer stops in to browse.
It's just a normal day. A woman comes into the shop. She starts looking around like she's looking at handbags, and then she asks for a certain size in a shoe. The worker goes to the back to find that shoe.
Little does the employee know, it's a setup.
The first person who walks into the store uses a distraction method of sorts.
This new surveillance video shows how it all went down.
While the worker is occupied in the back, a whole swarm of thieves descends on the store.
The rest of her accomplices come into the store and start grabbing everything they can in a matter of about 24 seconds.
The woman and her accomplices manage to snag 90 grand in merchandise.
They jump into a car, and then it's a high-speed chase. They're being chased down the street by cops. It gets up to over 100 miles per hour.
Police call off the chase out of concern for local residents.
High-speed chases are incredibly dangerous.
But luckily, the escape effort goes sideways.
The robbers crash the car up. They all get out on foot. They try to flee, but they're eventually captured, all except one. I hope they find that one woman, because clearly she might be the ringleader if she was the one that was brazen enough to go in and ask for the shoe in the first place. And she's probably committing these crimes in other places, so hopefully she's captured.
Her accomplices are charged with grand larceny, criminal possession of stolen property, and of a controlled substance. These high-end grab-and-goes are an all too familiar scene.
A lot of us watch heist films. If you're in and out as fast as possible, the likelihood you can get away is much higher.
This video captures a group clearing a store within minutes.
4 men busting into the Chanel store on Tuesday and raiding the place of designer goods by the fistful.
Robberies like this can happen anytime, day or night. This one was right smack in the middle of the afternoon.
The security guard confronted one of the people in the group, and he actually said to her, "What are you gonna do, shoot me?"
After a brave security guard confronts a group of thieves who are raiding a Chanel store, they bolt into a getaway car before police can get there.
This group stole 12 wallets, 32 handbags that were worth $200,000.
The high-end heist quickly hits the news.
A wild robbery caught on camera.
Here's some new video. It's from inside a Chanel store in Soho. A grab-and-go robbery unfolding in the middle of the day yesterday.
Grab-and-go thefts are notoriously hard to solve, but this time there's a glimpse of the license plate on the getaway car.
In this case, investigators were able to track the vehicle down and figure out exactly who it belongs to. It belongs to a rental company. It was later revealed that possibly phony documents were used.
It's a dead end. But then one of the suspects talks about the robbery online.
Social media is so funny. People can't help but brag online. And this guy said he actually stole so many handbags, he could open up his own boutique.
That leads police right to this man, Eric Spencer. He's convicted of conspiracy to commit robbery, among other charges, and faces up to 40 years in prison. His partners in crime remain at large. They may make for movie-like viral video, but they take a toll on innocent employees.
I think these grab-and-goes, they're called victimless crimes because people think that insurance covers everything. But what they don't realize is the trauma from the people who are in the store, that is not victimless.
That's what happens in San Francisco, where a restaurant full of people witness a traumatic event.
A man started yelling violent threats.
This story goes viral because of the brave young woman at the heart of it.
This is a video that is widely shared on social media and really gained a lot of attention.
You will be found, you will be arrested, and you will face criminal prosecution.
It's about 5 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon at a bustling burger joint. 19-year-old assistant manager Bianca Palomira is busy behind the counter. She has no idea that her whole life is about to change.
We start changing shifts. We weren't too short-staffed, but it was picking up. It was busy.
Outside, an SUV pulls up and 4 people get out.
I first saw them from a distance because they were in the front and I was in the back to the drive-thru area.
What Bianca doesn't know is that they are here to cause trouble.
This particular customer was allegedly bullying a special needs person inside of that establishment.
People who bully others who are perceived as being weaker tend to have a power complex, even if it means that someone else is getting hurt or ridiculed.
Out of camera view in the dining area, one of the men bullies an autistic teen. He's a friend of Bianca's, and she's furious, so she storms over to confront the man.
I just hear someone talking very loudly, very disrespectful, saying slurs to him, telling him he's gonna beat him up if he keeps looking at him. When I decided to say, you know, he's special needs.
But instead of listening to her, the man gets right in Bianca's face, yelling racial slurs. And then he hits her not once, but twice. Bianca's co-workers rush in to protect her, and numerous customers dial 911. The man's last punch hits Bianca right in the eye.
And she is viciously and very unfortunately attacked.
Her angry attacker pushes someone's order off a counter before fleeing. Bianca is rushed to a hospital where she gets sobering news.
They kept asking me if he was wearing any rings because they didn't think that a normal punch could rupture an eye.
A massive manhunt is launched to find the suspect.
The local police department in California teamed up very quickly with the United States Marshal Service, and they worked together in tandem to be able to track down leads and tips on this case.
It was definitely something that I was worried about, not only for me, but for my family. I mean, my sister was out on the news with me, so not only was I in danger, but also her.
For 3 weeks, she's on edge until he's finally arrested.
Bianca's story dominates the news and quickly goes viral.
The man got right into Palomira's face and yelled slurs at her.
The man then came after her. The second punch he threw hit her in the eye.
We're very proud of her. She did the right thing. Her heart was there when she did it.
With the help of online tipsters, the suspect, Isaac White Carter, is identified by U.S. Marshals and arrested outside his California home. But for Bianca, the arrest offers little solace.
The doctor came in to finally check on me. He opened my eye and I couldn't see anything at all. It was just black. I pretty much knew that I couldn't see.
Unfortunately, she did lose her eye in this incident.
Doctors replaced Bianca's right eye with a prosthetic.
She is in the process of healing right now.
From a psychiatrist's point of view, to lose such a vital organ can be highly traumatizing.
White Carter is charged with 2 felony counts, mayhem and assault causing great bodily injury. Bianca's community rallies to her side, raising nearly $250,000 for her medical care. And the mayor gives her a key to the city.
In my book, Bianca is a hero.
Bianca, in this case, appeared to try to protect someone who was very vulnerable. It seems like she is doing her best to heal and to move on with a bright future.
And remarkably, she doesn't regret stepping in to help.
It's kind of like, I'm not a mother, but it's kind of like protecting your child. And I was very protective over him, like I was protecting a friend.
In the early hours of July 14, 1966, a quiet brick townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street in South Chicago became the scene of one of the most devastating mass murders in modern American history. Before dawn arrived, 8 young student nurses had lost their lives. Another had survived only by remaining completely silent beneath a bed for hours. And an ordinary residential neighborhood had been transformed into a crime scene that would haunt investigators, medical professionals, and the American public for decades. The horror of that night did not unfold in a secluded wilderness or behind the walls of an abandoned building. It happened in a place that symbolized safety, a home shared by women who had dedicated themselves to caring for the sick. Their lives revolved around hospital schedules, demanding training, and the hope of becoming skilled nurses. They expected exhaustion after long shifts, not terror. Yet, over the course of a single night, those expectations were shattered forever. The Richard Speck murders remain one of the defining criminal cases of the 1960s, not simply because of the number of victims, but because of the chilling way the crimes unfolded. The violence stretched across several hours rather than a few chaotic moments. The victims were controlled one by one inside a familiar environment they believed would protect them. And when daylight finally broke, only one witness remained alive to tell investigators what had happened inside that house. Her observations would become the key that allowed police to identify and arrest the man responsible. Only days later, more than half a century has passed since those events, but the questions raised by that night continue to resonate. How could one armed man gain control of 9 young adults inside a crowded house? What allowed one woman to survive when 8 others did not? And why did this particular crime alter the way hospitals and residential facilities thought about security across the United States? These questions form the heart of this story. To understand the significance of what happened, it is necessary to return to South Chicago as it existed in the summer of 1966. At the time, South Chicago was a hardworking neighborhood shaped by factories, shipping activity, and families who built their lives around steady employment. The streets were lined with modest homes, apartment buildings, neighborhood businesses, churches, and schools. It was a community where people generally recognized their neighbors and where ordinary routines defined everyday life. Shift workers left for factories before sunrise, children played on sidewalks during the afternoon, and evenings settled into a predictable rhythm. Violence certainly existed in Chicago during the 1960s, as it did in many large American cities. But for many residents, home remained the place where danger was expected to end. Among those residents were a group of young women connected through their work at South Chicago Community Hospital. The hospital had rented a townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street to provide housing for student nurses. Completing their professional training, the arrangement was practical. Many of the women worked demanding schedules that included evenings, nights, weekends, and holidays. Living together close to the hospital reduced commuting time and allowed them to support one another. Through the pressures of medical education, The house itself was not extraordinary. It was simply a shared residence where young adults balanced responsibility with ordinary moments of friendship. They prepared meals, rested after exhausting shifts, discussed patients in classes, and looked ahead to careers devoted to helping others. Their futures appeared wide open. They represented different backgrounds and experiences, yet they were united by a common purpose. Every day, they entered hospital wards to comfort strangers, monitor recovering patients, and learn the skills required of professional nurses. Caring for vulnerable people had become part of their identity. Ironically, they would soon become the vulnerable ones. During the evening of July 13th, life inside the townhouse followed a familiar pattern. Some of the nurses had recently returned from work. Others were preparing for upcoming shifts or winding down before going to bed. There was no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. The house was filled with the ordinary sounds of people ending a long day. Outside, the neighborhood settled into the quiet that typically accompanies late-night hours. Nothing suggested that a violent stranger was moving through the area searching for an opportunity. Elsewhere in South Chicago, Richard Benjamin Speck was drifting through his own troubled existence. By the summer of 1966, his life had already been marked by repeated encounters with law enforcement, alcohol abuse, and instability. Born on December 6, 1941, in Illinois, Speck's early years had been shaped by hardship. His father died when he was still a child, and after his mother remarried. He grew up in a household where his stepfather frequently abused family members while struggling with alcoholism. Those early experiences did not excuse the choices Speck would later make, but they formed part of the troubled background that preceded his long criminal record. As he entered adolescence, violence, theft, drinking, and repeated arrests became recurring features of his life. School eventually disappeared from his priorities. Encounters with the justice system became increasingly common. By adulthood, his criminal history included theft, forgery, assault, disorderly conduct, and other offenses. His personal life proved equally unstable. A marriage ended in divorce despite the birth of a daughter. His problems with alcohol continued to deepen. In 1965, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a woman at knife point and served approximately 16 months in prison before being released. Rather than marking a turning point toward rehabilitation, his release became another step in a downward spiral. In April 1966, only a few months before the murders, Speck arrived in Chicago hoping to find employment aboard merchant ships operating on the Great Lakes. The opportunity never materialized. Unemployed and increasingly dependent on alcohol, he drifted between inexpensive boarding houses while spending much of his time drinking and searching unsuccessfully for work. According to the known facts of the case, on July 13th, he attempted once again to obtain employment but was unsuccessful. He spent much of that day drinking heavily, and by the time darkness fell, he was carrying both a .22 caliber handgun and a knife approximately 6 inches long. As midnight approached, two very different worlds were moving toward the same intersection. Inside the townhouse, 9 student nurses believed they had reached the safety of home after demanding work. Outside, an unemployed man with an extensive criminal history wandered through South Chicago armed with deadly weapons. Neither group knew the other existed. Within a matter of hours, their paths would cross in circumstances that would permanently alter American criminal history. Looking back today, it is tempting to search for obvious warning signs or moments when the tragedy could have been prevented. But one of the reasons this case continues to disturb people decades later is precisely because of how ordinary everything appeared before the violence began. The victims were not engaged in risky behavior. They were not involved in criminal activity. They were not expecting confrontation. They were simply ending another workday in the place they called home. That sense of ordinary routine is what makes the events that followed so profoundly unsettling. This story is not ultimately about the man whose name became attached to the case. Although Richard Speck would become one of America's most infamous murderers, The greater story belongs to the young women whose futures ended inside that townhouse, and to the sole survivor, whose remarkable composure would later provide investigators with the information needed to bring the killer to justice. Their lives, their courage, and the lessons drawn from that terrible night remain the true legacy of the Richard Speck murders. In the chapters that follow, we will begin not with the violence itself, but with the people whose lives filled that house before everything changed. Because before they became victims remembered in history books and criminal investigations, they were simply young nurses preparing to devote their lives to caring for others, unaware that the final hours of their ordinary evening had already begun. The townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street was never intended to become a place remembered by history. It was simply a residence rented by South Chicago Community Hospital to house student nurses who were completing one of the most demanding periods of their professional training. In the summer of 1966, the building represented opportunity rather than tragedy. For the young women who lived there, it offered something practical and reassuring, a place close to the hospital where they could rest between long shifts, study, share responsibilities, and support one another through the challenges of learning a profession built on compassion, discipline, and resilience. Long before investigators, reporters, and photographers gathered outside its doors, the townhouse was filled with the routines of ordinary life. Each day revolved around hospital schedules. Some residents left before sunrise while others returned late at night after exhausting hours spent caring for patients. Nursing students of that era faced physically demanding work and rigorous expectations. They were expected to remain calm under pressure, master technical skills, and provide comfort to people experiencing some of the most difficult moments of their lives. By the time they returned home each evening, fatigue was an unavoidable companion. Yet despite those demands, the townhouse offered moments of normality. It was where conversations continued after work, where uniforms were prepared for another shift, and where friendships grew among women who shared the same ambitions. Living together created a unique bond. Although each resident had her own background and personality, they understood one another's daily experiences in ways few others could. They knew the emotional weight carried home after difficult hospital shifts. They understood the pressure of examinations, clinical training, and the responsibility of caring for strangers whose health depended upon their competence. Their shared residence became more than simple accommodation. It became a small community built around mutual understanding. On the night of July 13, 1966, 9 young women occupied the house. 8 of them would become victims of one of America's most notorious mass murders. While one would survive under circumstances almost impossible to imagine, their names deserve to be remembered not simply because they were victims of violence, but because each represented a life dedicated to helping others. Patricia Matusek was among the student nurses living in the townhouse that summer. Like her housemates, she had chosen a profession centered on care and responsibility. The available historical record provided in this account does not attempt to reconstruct private details of her daily life beyond what is documented. But her presence in the house reflects the common purpose shared by all of its residents. Merlita Gargullo was another of the young nurses residing there. She was part of the same close-knit environment where students balanced demanding work with the hope of building meaningful medical careers. Nina Schmale also called the townhouse home, joining the others in the routines created by hospital schedules and shared responsibilities. Pamela Wilkening, Suzanne Ferris, Gloria Davy, Valentina Passion, and Mary and Jordan completed the group of 8 women whose lives would end before sunrise on July 14th. Their names have remained inseparable from the case for decades. Yet behind every name was an individual whose future had once seemed full of possibility. Collectively, they represented youth, education, and service. None could have imagined that their residence would become synonymous with one of the darkest nights in American criminal history. The 9th resident, Corazon Amureo, shared those same ambitions and responsibilities. Like the others, She was a student nurse pursuing her professional training. At that point, there was nothing to distinguish her from the rest of the household. She worked, studied, and lived alongside her fellow residents. Only after the events of that night would her name become known around the world as the sole survivor whose courage and careful observations helped solve the case. During the mid-1960s, communal housing for student nurses was not unusual. Hospitals frequently provided nearby accommodations to ensure trainees could respond to demanding schedules while remaining close to their clinical assignments. Such arrangements also fostered cooperation among students who often depended upon one another for emotional support. The townhouse therefore symbolized both convenience and security. It was intended to remove obstacles from the education of future nurses, not expose them to danger. South Chicago itself reflected the character of many American industrial neighborhoods during that era. Families built their lives around manufacturing, shipping, and steady employment. People walked familiar streets, shopped at neighborhood businesses, attended local churches, and generally viewed residential areas as places of refuge after long working days. While Chicago certainly experienced crime, the expectation remained that home was where people could close the door on the uncertainties of the outside world. The student nurses likely shared that expectation. Their demanding profession required confidence, discipline, and emotional strength. Each day they entered hospital rooms where illness, injury, fear, and grief were part of everyday life. They learned how to comfort frightened patients, monitor changing medical conditions, and remain composed during emergencies. The irony is impossible to ignore. Women trained to protect the lives of others would soon find themselves in desperate need of protection that never arrived. As evenings settled over South Chicago on July 13th, life inside the townhouse unfolded much as it had on countless previous nights. Some residents had recently completed hospital duties and returned home exhausted. Others prepared for upcoming shifts or simply relaxed after another demanding day. There was no indication that the ordinary rhythm of the evening would soon be interrupted. No warning suggested that someone unfamiliar with the house was approaching. No one inside could have anticipated that the safety they associated with home was about to disappear. At nearly the same time, Richard Benjamin Speck was moving through South Chicago under very different circumstances. By then, his personal history had already been shaped by repeated criminal behavior, failed opportunities, and chronic alcohol abuse. Born in Illinois on December 6, 1941, Speck's childhood had been marked by instability following the death of his father and his mother's remarriage to an abusive alcoholic. As he grew older, violence and criminal activity became increasingly common in his life. He accumulated arrests for theft, forgery, assault, disorderly conduct, and other offenses. His conviction for sexually assaulting a woman at knife point in 1965 further demonstrated a willingness to commit serious acts of violence. After serving approximately 16 months in prison, he was released and eventually traveled to Chicago hoping to secure work aboard merchant vessels operating on the Great Lakes. Instead of finding stability, he encountered disappointment. Employment proved difficult to obtain. He drifted between inexpensive boarding houses while drinking heavily. According to the established facts of the case, on July 13th, he again attempted to obtain work but failed. Throughout that day, he consumed significant amounts of alcohol. By nightfall, he possessed a .22 caliber handgun and a knife approximately 6 inches in length. Those two paths, the ordinary lives of 9 young nurses and the increasingly desperate existence of Richard Speck, were now moving toward the same destination. Neither side knew the other existed. The women inside the townhouse were occupied with familiar routines that reflected responsibility and hope for the future. Speck, meanwhile, wandered through South Chicago carrying weapons while searching for an opportunity to commit robbery. The contrast between these two worlds could hardly have been greater. One represented service, education, and ordinary domestic life. The other reflected instability, violence, and mounting desperation. Within hours, those separate worlds would collide in a way that permanently changed them both. Looking back from the perspective of history, it is tempting to imagine that some obvious warning sign must have existed. Yet the enduring power of this case lies partly in its ordinariness before the violence began. There were no dramatic confrontations earlier in the day, no known disputes connecting the victims to the perpetrator, and no indication that the townhouse had been specifically targeted because of the women who lived there. The available evidence indicates that the victims and Richard Speck were strangers. The house happened to become the place where his search for a robbery ended, and where an already dangerous situation evolved into something far more catastrophic. Before examining the events of that night in detail, it is important to pause and remember the people at the center of this story. They were not merely names listed in investigative reports or court documents. They were young healthcare professionals standing at the beginning of careers devoted to helping others. Their residence was meant to provide shelter between demanding hospital shifts. Instead, it became the setting for a crime that would forever alter discussions about residential security, criminal investigation, and the importance of one survivor whose determination to remain hidden through unimaginable fear would ultimately ensure that the man responsible could not escape justice. Long before his name became permanently linked to one of the most notorious mass murders in American history, Richard Benjamin Speck had already lived a life marked by instability, violence, and repeated encounters with the criminal justice system. Understanding his background does not explain the crimes he would eventually commit, nor does it diminish the suffering of his victims. Instead, it provides a factual context that existed before the night of July 13, 1966. The tragedy that unfolded inside the townhouse on East 100th Street did not emerge from nowhere. It followed years of personal instability, criminal behavior, and failed attempts to build a lawful and productive life. Richard Benjamin Speck was born on December 6, 1941, in Kirkwood, Illinois. During his earliest years, he experienced the loss of his father, who died when Speck was still a young child. The death of a parent can permanently alter the course of a family, and in Speck's case, it was followed by another significant change. His mother eventually remarried Carl Lindbergh, an alcoholic whose behavior introduced violence into the household. According to the available information, Lindbergh regularly abused both his wife and the children. The home environment in which Speck spent much of his childhood was therefore one defined not by stability, but by fear, conflict, and unpredictability. While many individuals endure difficult childhoods without ever committing violent crimes, these circumstances formed part of the background that investigators and historians later considered when examining Speck's life. As he entered adolescence, signs of serious behavioral problems became increasingly apparent. Rather than developing a stable education or pursuing constructive goals, Speck accumulated a pattern of conduct that repeatedly brought him into conflict with the law. He fought frequently, consumed alcohol at an early age, stole property, and was arrested multiple times. School gradually disappeared from his future. Instead of preparing for adulthood through education or vocational training, his teenage years became associated with delinquency and criminal activity. The progression was not sudden but gradual, with one offense leading to another and each encounter with the justice system failing to produce lasting change. Alcohol became an especially significant part of his life. According to the information available, heavy drinking began early and continued into adulthood. Excessive alcohol consumption did not create his violent tendencies, but it became a recurring feature of his lifestyle and appeared repeatedly throughout his criminal history. By the time he reached adulthood, intoxication and instability had become almost constant companions. Like many people attempting to establish ordinary lives despite troubled beginnings, Speck married while still relatively young. He married Shirley Malone, and together they had a daughter. For a brief period, marriage may have represented the possibility of stability and responsibility. However, the relationship eventually ended in divorce. The available information does not provide additional details regarding the breakdown of the marriage, and there is no need to speculate beyond the documented facts. What is clear is that the marriage did not alter the broader pattern already developing in Speck's life. His criminal behavior continued. Throughout the early 1960s, Speck accumulated arrests for a variety of offenses. These included theft, forgery, assault, disorderly conduct, public intoxication, and possession of a knife. Individually, many of these crimes might have appeared unrelated, but collectively, they revealed a consistent pattern of disregard for the law and repeated involvement in violent or threatening situations. Law enforcement agencies encountered him again and again, yet none of those encounters prevented what would happen in 1966. One offense in particular demonstrated an alarming escalation. In 1965, Speck was convicted of sexually assaulting a woman while threatening her with a knife. This crime combined sexual violence with the use of a weapon, revealing a willingness to intimidate and dominate another person through force. He received a prison sentence and served approximately 16 months before being released. His incarceration temporarily removed him from society, but upon release, there is no indication within the available information that he had undergone any meaningful rehabilitation capable of changing his behavior. Instead, he returned to civilian life, carrying the same patterns of instability that had characterized his past. Following his release, Speck relocated to Chicago during the spring of 1966. His stated objective was to obtain employment as a merchant seaman aboard ships operating on the Great Lakes. At least in theory, such work offered structure, income, and the possibility of beginning a different chapter. Merchant shipping demanded discipline and reliability, qualities that could have provided direction if sustained. However, the opportunity proved difficult to secure. Speck struggled to find employment and instead settled into an increasingly unstable existence. He lived in inexpensive boarding houses and spent much of his time moving between temporary accommodations. Without steady work, his financial situation deteriorated further. The available information indicates that heavy drinking remained a central part of his daily routine. Days were increasingly spent consuming alcohol, borrowing money, gambling, and searching unsuccessfully for employment. Rather than moving toward stability, his circumstances continued to decline. By early July 1966, only days before the murders, Speck's situation had become especially precarious. He remained unemployed despite repeated attempts to find work aboard ships. On July 13th, according to the documented account, he once again sought employment but was rejected. Another opportunity had disappeared. That same day, he consumed large amounts of alcohol, eventually spending nearly all of the money he still possessed. As evening approached, he was left without employment, without meaningful financial resources, and under the influence of alcohol. Yet those circumstances alone cannot explain what followed. Countless unemployed individuals experienced disappointment without committing acts of violence. The decisions that came next belonged solely to Richard Speck. At some point that evening, he armed himself with two weapons, a .22 caliber handgun and a knife approximately 6 inches in length. Possessing both a firearm and a knife significantly increased his ability to threaten others. After darkness fell, he began walking through South Chicago. According to the available information, he was searching for an opportunity to commit robbery. His original objective appears to have been theft rather than mass murder. Investigators later concluded that robbery was the initial motive before the situation escalated into prolonged violence. This distinction is important because it reflects the known evidence rather than speculation. As he moved through the neighborhood, Speck eventually approached the townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street. At that moment, there was no documented connection between him and the women living inside. They were strangers. There was no evidence of a personal dispute, previous acquaintance, or plan targeting based upon their identities. The house simply became the location where his search for victims ended. Inside the residence, the student nurses believed the day was over. Some had already gone to bed after exhausting hospital shifts. Others were preparing to sleep or relaxing before another day of clinical work. Their thoughts were almost certainly focused on ordinary concerns, rest, work schedules, responsibilities awaiting them the following morning. Outside, Speck approached carrying a handgun and a knife. Two completely separate lives were about to intersect for the first and only time. Looking back decades later, it is impossible to ignore the contrast between these two realities. On one side stood 9 young women preparing for careers devoted to saving lives. Their days revolved around hospitals, patients, education, and service. On the other side was a man whose adult life had become defined by violence. Repeated criminal convictions, failed opportunities, and heavy alcohol abuse. Their paths should never have crossed. Yet history is often shaped by moments that appear almost random until viewed in retrospect. Had Speck found employment aboard a ship? Had he chosen a different street? Or had he abandoned his search for robbery altogether? The events that followed might never have occurred. Those possibilities, however, belong to speculation rather than history. The historical record documents only what did happen. On the night of July 13, 1966, Richard Speck walked through South Chicago carrying a handgun and a knife after spending the day drinking and failing to obtain work. Eventually, he reached the townhouse occupied by 9 student nurses from South Chicago Community Hospital. Inside, the women believed they were safe within the walls of their shared home. Outside, an armed stranger approached the rear entrance. Within minutes, an ordinary summer night would become one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. And a robbery that initially appeared straightforward would evolve into hours of unimaginable violence that would leave 8 women dead. One survivor forever changed, and an entire nation struggling to understand how such a crime could have unfolded inside an ordinary neighborhood home. As July 13, 1966, gave way to the late hours of the evening, there was little to distinguish that night from countless others in South Chicago. The streets gradually became quieter as businesses closed and families settled into their homes. Inside the townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street, the student nurses followed the familiar rhythm that had become part of their daily lives. Long hospital shifts demanded early mornings, irregular schedules, and physical endurance, making rest one of the most valuable parts of the day. Some of the women had already changed into sleepwear after returning from work, while others were preparing for bed or finishing ordinary conversations before the house grew quiet. It was a routine built on trust. They trusted the neighborhood around them, trusted the walls of the house they shared, and trusted that another ordinary day awaited them when morning arrived. None of them knew that, only a short distance away, Richard Benjamin Speck was moving through the neighborhood, carrying both a .22 caliber handgun and a knife approximately 6 inches long. Earlier that day, Speck had once again attempted to find employment aboard a merchant vessel, hoping to secure work that had repeatedly eluded him since arriving in Chicago several months earlier. His efforts had failed. According to the documented facts of the case, he spent much of the day drinking heavily and exhausted nearly all of the money he still possessed. By nightfall, he was unemployed, intoxicated, armed, and wandering through South Chicago in search of an opportunity to commit robbery. At that stage, the available evidence indicates that robbery was his initial objective. The townhouse occupied by the student nurses was not selected because of any personal connection. The women inside did not know Speck, and there is no evidence that he knew them. They were strangers whose lives happened to intersect under catastrophic circumstances. As Speck walked through the neighborhood, he eventually reached the rear of the residence. It was approaching 11 p.m. when he knocked on the back door. Inside the house, the knock did not immediately signal danger. The women living there had no apparent reason to expect that opening the door would expose them to an armed intruder. One of the student nurses responded to the knock and opened the rear entrance. In a matter of seconds, the atmosphere inside the home changed completely. Speck immediately produced his handgun and took control of the situation. According to the available information, he told those inside, "Don't scream. I only want money." Those words established what everyone present naturally believed. This appeared to be a robbery. Although terrifying, armed robberies often ended once valuables had been surrendered. Faced with a gunman demanding money, cooperation seemed the safest possible response. The women complied. They handed over wallets, cash, watches, jewelry, and other personal belongings. The total value of the property was relatively small, amounting to only a modest sum of money and a few personal possessions. Everything about the encounter suggested that the robbery could soon be over. Had Speck simply left after taking the valuables, the crime would still have been traumatic, but the outcome would have been profoundly different. Instead, the situation began moving in an entirely different direction. Rather than leaving the house after collecting the valuables, Speck remained inside. That decision transformed the nature of the crime. The robbery was no longer ending. It was only beginning. Speck proceeded to establish complete control over the occupants of the townhouse. Using bed sheets found inside the residence, he bound the women one by one. Their hands were tied, limiting their ability to resist or flee. He ordered them onto the floor and maintained control by threatening them with his firearm. The women continued to cooperate, believing that compliance offered the greatest chance of survival. There is nothing in the documented record to suggest that they acted irrationally. Faced with an armed intruder, following his instructions would have appeared to be the most logical course of action. During these moments, fear undoubtedly spread throughout the house. Yet there also remained reason to hope. The intruder had demanded money. He had received it. The victims had offered no resistance. They had done exactly what is commonly advised during an armed robbery: avoid provoking further violence and comply with demands whenever possible. From their perspective, every additional minute of cooperation might have increased the likelihood that the ordeal would soon end. Instead, the opposite occurred. Speck did not keep all 9 women together in a single room. According to investigators, he appeared concerned that such a large group might eventually attempt to overpower him despite being bound. 9 individuals acting together could potentially present a serious challenge, even to an armed assailant. Whether consciously or instinctively, Speck adopted a different method. He began separating them. One by one, he selected individual women and escorted them upstairs. This decision fundamentally altered the psychological environment inside the house. Rather than confronting the group collectively, he isolated each victim from the others. Those left behind remained unable to see what was happening upstairs. They could only listen. The sounds drifting through the house gradually revealed that the situation had become far more dangerous than anyone had initially imagined. According to the available information, those remaining downstairs heard footsteps moving across the upper floor. Occasionally, there were brief cries or sounds of struggle. Then came silence. After some time, Speck returned downstairs and selected another woman. Once again, footsteps climbed the stairs. Once again, voices or movement could be heard. Once again, silence followed. This pattern repeated over the course of several hours. For the women waiting below, uncertainty itself became a form of terror. They could not see the fate of their friends. They could only recognize that each person taken upstairs failed to return. As the night progressed, the hope that the ordeal might still end peacefully grew increasingly difficult to sustain. Although the available historical record does not attempt to reconstruct every individual thought experienced by those inside the house, the documented sequence of events reveals a steadily escalating crisis. The women were isolated from one another, physically restrained, and deprived of information beyond the disturbing sounds reaching them from another part of the residence. Every trip up the stairs represented another unknown. Every return by Speck without the previous victim intensified the realization that something far more terrible than robbery was unfolding. Later forensic examinations established that multiple methods of killing had been used. Some victims suffered numerous stab wounds. Others were strangled or manually choked. Evidence also indicated that some victims had been sexually assaulted before they were killed. The injuries varied from victim to victim, demonstrating that the attacks occurred separately rather than during one brief burst of violence. Investigators concluded that the murders unfolded over several hours, making the psychological burden on those still waiting downstairs almost impossible to comprehend. Yet amid this unfolding horror, one woman quietly recognized a crucial pattern. Corazon Amureo observed that the number of people in the room continued to decrease. One by one, her fellow student nurses disappeared after being taken upstairs. None returned. Although she could not know exactly what had happened, the pattern itself became impossible to ignore. Remaining where she was appeared increasingly likely to end in death. At some point while Speck was occupied elsewhere in the house, Corazon made an extraordinary decision. Rather than remain where she had been placed, she slowly and silently moved toward another bedroom. There, she crawled beneath a bed and carefully pulled the bedspread downward, attempting to conceal herself completely from view. Every movement carried enormous risk. Any sound might have revealed her location. Any mistake might have drawn Speck's attention. Yet remaining where she had been seemed equally dangerous. Moments later, Speck returned downstairs. According to the documented account, he counted the women under his control but failed to realize that one person was missing. Whether because of the darkness, confusion, or simple miscalculation, he believed everyone remained exactly where he had left them. Corazon's hiding place remained undiscovered. It was a moment of extraordinary consequence. Without realizing it, Speck had left behind the one witness who would eventually describe him to investigators in remarkable detail. As the night continued, Corazon remained hidden beneath the bed while the violence elsewhere in the house continued. The robbery that had begun with a demand for money had fully transformed into one of the most horrifying crimes in modern American history. By the time dawn approached, 8 lives had been taken. One witness remained hidden in absolute silence, and the townhouse that had once symbolized safety for a group of young nurses had become the scene of unimaginable devastation. The longest hours of the night were still not over, and for the woman hidden beneath the bed, survival would depend on remaining completely motionless until she could be certain the man responsible had finally left the house. The hours that followed became the longest and most terrifying of the entire night. By this point, the robbery that had begun with a demand for money had evolved into something far more devastating. Inside the townhouse, Richard Speck maintained complete control over the residents through the constant threat of violence. The women had already surrendered their cash, jewelry, watches, and other personal belongings. They had complied with every instruction given to them. From the perspective of the victims, there had been every reason to believe that cooperation would eventually bring the ordeal to an end. Instead, the pattern established by the intruder suggested the opposite. He showed no intention of leaving. Instead, he continued moving through the house, repeatedly traveling between the first and second floors while keeping the remaining women under his control. Investigators later concluded that Speck deliberately avoided keeping all 9 women together in one place because he feared they might eventually overpower him despite being restrained. Whether that concern arose from careful planning or instinctive caution, the result was the same. He continued removing the victims individually. Each journey upstairs isolated another young woman from the group. Each return downstairs deepened the fear experienced by those still waiting. The sequence repeated itself again and again over several hours. Those who remained downstairs could hear only fragments of what was taking place above them. According to the available information, they heard footsteps crossing the floor overhead. At times, there were brief cries, sounds of movement, or indications of a struggle. Then silence followed. That silence may have been even more frightening than the noises that preceded it because it offered no explanation and no reassurance. After a period of quiet, Speck would descend the staircase once more, enter the room where the remaining women were being held, and select another victim. Without explanation, he led her upstairs while the others remained behind. Once again, footsteps echoed through the house. Once again, the remaining women listened without knowing exactly what was happening. Once again, silence returned. The process unfolded repeatedly throughout the night. It is impossible to know precisely what each victim thought during those long hours, and it would be inappropriate to invent emotions or conversations that are not supported by the historical record. What is documented, however, is enough to understand the unimaginable uncertainty they faced. Every passing minute increased the realization that something had gone terribly wrong. The robbery had not ended after the valuables were surrendered. The women taken upstairs did not come back. The man holding them captive continued returning alone. That pattern alone would have been enough to create overwhelming fear. The physical environment of the house, once associated with comfort and routine, had become unrecognizable. Rooms that only hours earlier had been places of conversation and rest were now scenes of captivity. Bed sheets that normally served ordinary household purposes had been turned into restraints. The staircase connecting the two floors became the route along which each victim disappeared from. The sight of the others, the familiarity of the home, only intensified the tragedy. Everything around the women was recognizable, yet nothing about the situation resembled the ordinary lives they had known only a short time before. As investigators later reconstructed the events, they determined that the attacks did not occur in a single burst of uncontrolled violence. Instead, they unfolded separately over an extended period. The medical examination revealed that different methods had been used. Some victims sustained numerous stab wounds. Others died from strangulation or manual choking. Evidence also showed that some victims had been sexually assaulted before they were killed. The variation in injuries reinforced the conclusion that each attack occurred individually rather than simultaneously. This finding became one of the defining characteristics of the case. The tragedy extended across several hours, making it fundamentally different from crimes in which multiple victims are attacked within only a few moments. Every return downstairs by Speck marked the beginning of another individual assault. The gradual nature of the violence distinguished the case in the minds of investigators and later historians. Rather than one brief explosion of brutality, the crimes unfolded as a prolonged sequence in which each victim faced the danger separately. This understanding also helped explain why one woman eventually recognized an opportunity to act. Corazon Amureo had been observing the pattern developing inside the house. She realized that the number of women remaining together continued to shrink. One after another, her fellow student nurses disappeared upstairs and never returned. She could not see exactly what had happened to them, but the pattern itself became unmistakable. Waiting passively no longer appeared to offer any realistic hope of survival. At some point while Speck was occupied elsewhere inside the residence, Corazon made the decision that would ultimately save her life. She quietly left the place where she had been kept and slowly crawled toward another bedroom. Every movement demanded extraordinary caution. The house was silent except for the sounds created by the intruder. Any accidental noise could have exposed her position immediately. She reached another bed and slid underneath it, carefully lowering the bedspread so that it concealed her completely. The space beneath the bed became her only refuge. There was no certainty that the hiding place would remain undiscovered. It merely offered a chance where almost none seemed to exist. Shortly afterward, Speck returned downstairs. According to the available information, he counted the women under his control, but mistakenly believed that everyone remained present. Whether because of poor lighting, confusion, or simple miscalculation, he failed to notice that one person had disappeared from the group. That single mistake proved decisive. Corazon remained hidden while the violence elsewhere in the house continued. From beneath the bed, she experienced the remainder of the night without knowing whether each passing minute would be her last. The historical record describes what she later reported hearing while concealed beneath the bed. She heard footsteps as Speck continued moving through the house. She heard crying. She heard pleading. She heard sounds consistent with movement and violence elsewhere in the residence. Then, after each episode, silence returned. Those alternating moments of noise and quiet stretched across the remaining hours before dawn. Corazon remained completely still throughout this period. She later explained that she did not dare breathe loudly or shift her position for fear that even the smallest movement might reveal her hiding place. The discipline required to remain motionless under such circumstances is difficult to comprehend. Every instinct might have urged escape, yet leaving the hiding place too early almost certainly would have exposed her to the man still inside the house. Instead, she continued waiting. Time lost its ordinary meaning. Minutes likely felt like hours as she listened for any indication that Speck might still be nearby. According to the established timeline, he remained inside the townhouse for several hours after entering it. Only around 6 o'clock in the morning did he finally leave the residence. Even then, Corazon did not immediately emerge from beneath the bed. She could not know whether he had truly gone or whether he might return unexpectedly. Remaining hidden appeared safer than risking discovery. She continued waiting in silence even after the house itself had grown quiet. Eventually, after additional time had passed and she believed the danger had finally ended, she carefully emerged from beneath the bed. The house around her had become a place almost beyond recognition. Rather than opening the front door, she climbed through a window to seek help from neighboring residents. Around 7:30 that morning, she succeeded in alerting them to the unimaginable events that had unfolded during the night. Her actions marked the beginning of the official investigation. Until that moment, no one outside the townhouse knew the scale of the tragedy that had occurred within its walls. Police officers responding to the scene entered expecting to investigate a serious crime. But what they discovered exceeded even the experience of seasoned investigators. 8 young student nurses had been killed inside the residence that had served as their home. One survivor remained alive only because she had possessed the presence of mind to recognize the changing pattern of events, find a hiding place, and remain absolutely silent for hours while the man responsible continued moving through the house. The nightmare that had begun with a knock on the back door had finally ended. But the investigation into one of America's most shocking mass murders was only beginning. Within days, the observations made by the sole survivor would become the foundation upon which detectives built the case against Richard Benjamin Speck, transforming the testimony of one frightened witness into the crucial evidence that would lead law enforcement directly to the man responsible for the deaths of 8 innocent women. When the first light of morning reached South Chicago on July 14, 1966, the violence inside the townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street had finally come to an end. According to the established timeline of the case, Richard Speck left the residence at approximately 6 o'clock that morning after spending several hours inside. Yet for the only surviving witness, his departure did not immediately bring relief. Hidden beneath a bed, Corazon Amureo had no way of knowing whether the man who had terrorized the house had truly gone or whether he might return at any moment. The silence that followed his departure offered no certainty. After enduring an entire night listening to footsteps, cries, pleading, movement, and long stretches of frightening quiet, every decision still carried enormous risk. Remaining hidden felt safer than stepping into the unknown. Corazon therefore continued lying motionless beneath the bed even after the house itself had become still. During those additional minutes, the townhouse stood in complete contrast to the home it had been only hours earlier. It had once been a place where student nurses returned after demanding shifts at South Chicago Community Hospital, where conversations, shared meals, and plans for the future had filled the rooms. Now it had become a silent crime scene. The familiar surroundings had been transformed beyond recognition, not because the building itself had changed, but because of what had occurred inside it. Every room now held the memory of the night's events. Every floorboard that had carried ordinary footsteps now carried the weight of tragedy. Corazon remained hidden until she believed enough time had passed to reduce the possibility that Speck might still be nearby. Even then, leaving her hiding place required extraordinary courage. The decision was no longer simply about saving herself. If she survived, she would become the only person capable of telling investigators what had happened during the previous several hours. Without knowing it, she carried information that would soon prove essential to solving one of the most shocking murder cases in American history. Carefully, she emerged from beneath the bed. Rather than walking directly through the house toward the front entrance, she chose another route. According to the available information, she climbed through a window and sought help from nearby neighbors. At approximately 7:30 that morning, she was finally able to alert others that something unimaginable had occurred inside the townhouse. Her escape marked the first moment anyone outside the residence became aware that the previous night had ended in mass murder rather than armed robbery. Emergency assistance was summoned immediately. Police officers arrived at the residence expecting to investigate a violent crime, but nothing fully prepared them for what awaited inside. Entering the townhouse, investigators discovered 8 victims located in different areas of the house. The women who had shared that residence only hours earlier had all been killed. The victims were identified as Patricia Matusek, Merlita Gargullo, Nina Schmale, Pamela Wilkening, Suzanne Ferris, Gloria Davy, Valentina Passion, and Mary Ann Jordan. Their deaths represented not only an immense personal tragedy for their families, friends, and colleagues, but also a devastating loss for a profession devoted to caring for others. The available historical record describes the reaction of investigators in clear terms. Even experienced officers were deeply shocked by the scene they encountered. Throughout their careers, many had investigated violent crimes, yet the scale of what had occurred inside the townhouse distinguished this case from nearly everything they had previously experienced. The murders had unfolded over several hours, involved multiple methods of killing, and left behind an extraordinary amount of physical evidence requiring careful examination. The crime scene immediately became one of the highest priorities for the Chicago Police Department. While forensic personnel began documenting the house, detectives turned their attention toward the only surviving witness. Corazon Amureo had endured an experience almost impossible to comprehend. Despite the overwhelming trauma she had just survived, her observations proved remarkably detailed. Rather than offering only vague impressions, she was able to provide investigators with a description of the man responsible for the attack. According to the information she supplied, the intruder was a white male with dark hair, approximately 25 years old, possessing a Southern accent and several noticeable tattoos. At first glance, such a description might appear relatively general. Yet one feature immediately stood out. The tattoos were distinctive. Unlike clothing, hairstyles, or facial hair, tattoos are permanent identifying characteristics that can significantly narrow the search for a suspect. Corazon's ability to remember that detail would soon become one of the most important elements of the investigation. Detectives recognized that the surviving witness represented their greatest investigative advantage. There were no security cameras recording the events of the night. There were no digital records tracking the movements of the offender. The investigation depended heavily upon physical evidence recovered inside the townhouse and the testimony of the only person who had seen the perpetrator and lived to describe him. Corazon's composure under unimaginable circumstances, therefore, became a cornerstone of the case. Law enforcement agencies quickly circulated the description she had provided. Officers throughout the area received information describing a white male, approximately 25 years old, with dark hair, a Southern accent, and prominent tattoos. The search expanded rapidly because authorities understood the urgency of locating a suspect capable of committing such extraordinary violence. Meanwhile, Richard Speck was no longer inside the townhouse. According to the established facts of the case, only 3 days after the murders, he attempted to end his own life after learning that he had become a suspect. He attempted suicide by taking poison and required emergency medical treatment. Rather than dying, however, he was transported to a hospital where doctors worked to save his life. That unexpected hospitalization created the turning point in the investigation. During Speck's treatment, one of the physicians noticed a distinctive tattoo on his arm bearing the words, "Born to Raise Hell." The phrase immediately attracted attention because Corazon had specifically mentioned that the man she saw inside the townhouse had several tattoos. The physician recognized that the patient matched the widely circulated description connected to the mass murder investigation. Understanding the significance of the observation, hospital personnel contacted law enforcement without delay. Police officers quickly responded to the hospital. Speck, recovering from his unsuccessful suicide attempt, suddenly found himself confronted not by doctors alone, but by detectives investigating one of the nation's most notorious murder cases. The investigation had advanced with remarkable speed. Only days earlier, the perpetrator had left the townhouse believing that one witness remained hidden forever. Instead, that witness had survived, described him in considerable detail, and provided investigators with the information needed to identify him. Speck was arrested while still in his hospital bed. The speed of the arrest demonstrated the extraordinary importance of Corazon's testimony, although investigators would continue gathering additional evidence. The case had already reached a decisive moment. The man fitting the survivor's description had been located before he could disappear permanently. One of the most significant steps that followed involved formal identification procedures. According to the available information, Corazon Amureo identified Richard Speck without hesitation. After surviving hours hidden beneath a bed, she recognized the man responsible for the attack when given the opportunity. Her certainty provided investigators with additional confidence that they had arrested the correct suspect. Yet identification alone would not be enough to secure a conviction. Detectives still needed to assemble every available piece of physical evidence connecting Speck to the townhouse and to the murders themselves. As forensic examinations continued, investigators searched for fingerprints, clothing, weapons, stolen property, and every other item capable of confirming the survivor's testimony. The strength of the eventual prosecution would depend not on a single witness or a single clue, but on the combination of multiple independent forms of evidence pointing toward the same individual. Nevertheless, the investigation never lost sight of the fact that its earliest breakthrough had come from one remarkable survivor. Corazon Amureo's decision to hide beneath the bed, remain absolutely silent for hours, escape only after she believed the danger had passed, and then calmly provide investigators with an accurate description of the offender fundamentally changed the course of the case. Without her survival, detectives would have faced an investigation with no eyewitness capable of describing the man responsible. Instead, because she lived, the search narrowed quickly. A distinctive tattoo became the crucial identifying feature, and within only a few days Richard Benjamin Speck was under arrest. The long process of proving his guilt in court was still ahead, but the investigation had already achieved its most critical objective. The suspect believed responsible for one of the deadliest mass murders in Illinois history was no longer free. With Richard Benjamin Speck under arrest, the investigation entered a new and equally important phase. Locating a suspect was only the beginning. Detectives and prosecutors now faced the responsibility of building a case capable of proving, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the man in custody had committed the murders inside the townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street. Because the crime had shocked the nation, every stage of the investigation would be examined closely by the public, the courts, and the families of the victims. A successful prosecution could not rely upon suspicion or public outrage alone. It required evidence that connected Speck directly to the scene, to the victims, and to the events that unfolded during the night of July 13th and the early morning hours of July 14th, 1966. Fortunately for investigators, the case did not depend upon a single piece of evidence. Instead, it gradually developed into a combination of eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, and inconsistencies in Speck's own statements. Each element strengthened the others, creating a body of proof that prosecutors would later present before a jury. One of the first and most significant steps after Speck's arrest involved the continued cooperation of Corazon Amureo, the sole survivor. Her survival had already transformed the investigation by providing detectives with a detailed description of the intruder. Now her role became even more important. According to the available information, she participated in identification procedures and recognized Richard Speck without hesitation. This identification carried enormous weight because she had spent several hours in the same house as the intruder, hearing him speak and observing him before successfully hiding beneath the bed. Her certainty did not stand alone, however. Investigators understood that eyewitness testimony, while valuable, becomes even stronger when supported by independent physical evidence. For that reason, forensic teams continued their careful examination of the townhouse. Every room was documented. Every item that might contain fingerprints or other identifying evidence was examined. The objective was clear: determine whether physical traces placed Richard Speck inside the residence. According to the documented facts of the case, investigators recovered Speck's fingerprints at the crime scene. Fingerprint evidence represented one of the most reliable forensic techniques available during the 1960s. Unlike witness recollections, fingerprints provided physical confirmation that a specific individual had touched objects within the residence. The discovery of Speck's fingerprints therefore directly supported Corazon's identification. Together, the eyewitness testimony and fingerprint evidence significantly strengthened the investigation. Detectives also examined the property recovered when Speck was arrested. During the robbery, the victims had surrendered cash, watches, jewelry, wallets, and other personal belongings after Speck announced that he wanted money. Investigators later discovered property belonging to the victims in Speck's possession. This finding established another direct connection between the suspect and the townhouse. The stolen items were not random possessions. They belonged to the women who had been robbed shortly before they were murdered. Their presence among Speck's belongings reinforced the conclusion that he had remained inside the residence after committing the robbery. Additional physical evidence further strengthened the case. Investigators recovered a knife that matched the injuries documented during the autopsies. They also examined clothing associated with Speck and found bloodstains. While each piece of evidence carried its own importance, prosecutors recognized that the true strength of the investigation lay in how these separate findings supported one another. Fingerprints placed Speck inside the house. The surviving witness identified him as the intruder. Property stolen from the victims was found in his possession. The knife corresponded to the injuries suffered by the victims. Bloodstained clothing added yet another connection. No single element stood alone. Instead, each reinforced the overall conclusion that investigators had identified the correct suspect. Detectives also interviewed Speck extensively after his arrest. During questioning, they compared his statements against the physical evidence already collected. According to the available information, Speck denied responsibility for the murders. However, investigators noted inconsistencies in his explanations. Contradictions in a suspect's account do not by themselves establish guilt. But when considered alongside physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, they may further undermine credibility. In Speck's case, prosecutors would later argue that his conflicting statements reflected an inability to explain away the growing body of evidence connecting him to the crimes. While investigators continued assembling evidence, news of the murders spread rapidly across the United States. Newspapers devoted extensive coverage to the case. The public followed each new development closely as authorities revealed additional details. Regarding the investigation, the brutality of the murders, the number of victims, and the remarkable survival of Corazon Amureo ensured that the case remained at the center of national attention. For many Americans, the crimes challenged deeply held assumptions about personal safety. The victims had been attacked, not while traveling alone or walking deserted streets, but inside the home where they lived together while training to become nurses. Their profession emphasized care, responsibility, and service to others. The contrast between their ordinary lives and the extraordinary violence committed against them intensified the emotional impact of the case. Meanwhile, investigators continued refining the evidence that would eventually be presented in court. Every report had to be carefully prepared. Every item recovered from the crime scene required documentation establishing where it had been found and how it had been preserved. Maintaining the integrity of physical evidence was essential because the defense would inevitably examine every aspect of the investigation for possible weaknesses. Detectives therefore followed procedures designed to ensure that evidence presented during trial would withstand legal scrutiny. The prosecution also prepared to demonstrate the sequence of events inside the townhouse. According to the investigation, Speck had entered the residence armed with a handgun and a knife, announced that he wanted money, restrained the women using bed sheets, robbed them of their valuables, and then began taking them upstairs individually. Medical examinations established that multiple methods of killing had been used, including stabbing and strangulation, while evidence indicated that some victims had also been sexually assaulted. The prolonged nature of the attacks became an important aspect of the prosecution's theory because it demonstrated that the violence continued over several hours rather than occurring during a brief, uncontrollable outburst. This chronology would later become central to explaining the deliberate nature of the crimes. Throughout this period, Corazon Amureo remained indispensable to the investigation. Beyond identifying Speck, she helped investigators reconstruct the sequence of events as accurately as possible. Her observations concerning the intruder's appearance, his southern accent, his tattoos, and his repeated movements between the floors of the townhouse allowed detectives to understand how the crimes had unfolded. Her account was particularly important because she alone had witnessed the beginning of the robbery and survived long enough to describe the pattern by which the victims were separated. Without her testimony, investigators would have relied almost entirely upon physical evidence. Instead, they possessed both forensic proof and a first-hand narrative from the only surviving witness. As the months passed, preparations for trial accelerated. Prosecutors believed they possessed overwhelming evidence against Richard Speck. They intended to demonstrate that he had voluntarily entered the townhouse, taken control of 9 unarmed women, robbed them, and then killed 8 of them over the course of several hours. The defense, meanwhile, would seek to challenge aspects of the prosecution's case and later argue that Speck's heavy alcohol use and mental condition should be considered. Those arguments, however, would ultimately be evaluated by a jury tasked with weighing all of the available evidence. By the time court proceedings approached, the investigation had assembled a comprehensive case built upon multiple independent sources of proof. The eyewitness identification by Corazon Amureo, the fingerprints recovered from the crime scene, the victim's property found in Speck's possession, the knife consistent with the victim's injuries, the blood-stained clothing, and the inconsistencies within Speck's own statements combined to create a compelling body of evidence. Together, these findings transformed one survivor's desperate effort to remain alive beneath a bed into a successful criminal investigation that had identified, arrested, and prepared to prosecute the man accused of committing one of the most horrifying mass murders in Illinois history. The courtroom would now become the setting where every piece of that evidence would be examined, challenged, and ultimately judged before the law. When the trial of Richard Benjamin Speck began in April 1967, it attracted extraordinary public attention. The murders at the townhouse on East 100th Street had already become one of the most widely discussed criminal cases in the United States. For months, newspapers had reported on the investigation, the arrest, and the growing body of evidence gathered by law enforcement. The public followed every development with intense interest, not only because of the number of victims, but also because of the shocking circumstances under which the crimes had occurred. 8 young student nurses had been killed inside the residence they believed was a place of safety, while a single survivor had escaped detection by remaining hidden beneath a bed for hours before providing investigators with the information that ultimately led to the arrest of the suspect. As the courtroom proceedings opened, the responsibility shifted from investigators to the legal system. The question before the court was no longer whether the crimes had occurred. That tragic fact had already been established. Instead, the central issue was whether the prosecution could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Richard Benjamin Speck had committed those crimes and was legally responsible for them. The prosecution presented a case built upon multiple independent forms of evidence rather than relying upon any single witness or physical exhibit. Prosecutors argued that the events of the night demonstrated a deliberate sequence of actions. According to the evidence, Speck arrived at the townhouse armed with a .22 caliber handgun and a knife approximately 6 inches in length. He gained control of the women inside the house by threatening them with the firearm, announced that he wanted money, and collected their cash, jewelry, watches, and other valuables. He then restrained them using bed sheets found inside the residence. Up to that point, the prosecution acknowledged the crime appeared to resemble an armed robbery. However, the evidence showed that Speck did not leave after obtaining the property. Instead, he remained inside the house for several hours and systematically removed the women one by one from the group before killing 8 of them. Prosecutors emphasized that the extended duration of the crimes distinguished the case from an impulsive act of violence. The murders unfolded over many hours, with each victim isolated from the others. Medical examinations established that different methods had been used, including stabbing and strangulation, while evidence indicated that some victims had also been sexually assaulted before being killed. The prosecution argued that this sequence demonstrated purposeful conduct rather than a momentary loss of control. One of the most important witnesses presented by the prosecution was Corazon Amureo, the only survivor. Her testimony provided the jury with a direct account of the beginning of the attack and the terrifying pattern that followed. She described how the intruder entered the townhouse armed with a gun, demanded money, restrained the occupants, and gradually removed the women one at a time. She also explained how she realized that the number of women in the room continued to decrease and that none of those taken upstairs returned. Believing that remaining where she was would almost certainly lead to her own death, she quietly hid beneath another bed while the intruder continued moving through the house. Corazon further testified that she remained completely silent for hours, listening to footsteps, crying, pleading, movement, and periods of silence until she finally believed the intruder had left. After emerging from her hiding place, she escaped through a window and sought help from neighbors, leading police to the crime scene. Her testimony was calm, detailed, and consistent with the physical evidence collected during the investigation. Perhaps most importantly, she identified Richard Speck as the man responsible. The prosecution reinforced her testimony with the physical evidence gathered by investigators. Fingerprints recovered from the townhouse placed Speck inside the residence. Property belonging to the victims was found in his possession following his arrest. Investigators also recovered a knife that corresponded with the injuries documented during the autopsies, while bloodstained clothing provided additional support for the prosecution's case. Rather than asking the jury to rely upon only one form of proof, prosecutors demonstrated how every major category of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. Eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence, recovered property, and investigative findings all supported one another. During the trial, prosecutors also addressed Speck's conduct following the murders. 3 days after the crimes, according to the evidence presented, Speck attempted suicide after learning that he had become a suspect. Although the suicide attempt itself was not proof of guilt, it formed part of the broader chronology presented to the jury. More significantly, the physician who treated Speck noticed the distinctive tattoo bearing the words, "Born to Raise Hell," a feature that closely matched the description previously provided by Corazon Amureo. That observation led hospital personnel to notify law enforcement, resulting in Speck's arrest while still receiving medical treatment. The prosecution argued that the arrest was not the result of chance alone, but of the survivors. Careful observations combined with the doctor's recognition of the identifying tattoo. The defense, meanwhile, sought to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. According to the available information, defense attorneys argued that Speck suffered from severe alcohol abuse and mental problems. They attempted to persuade the jury that these conditions affected his responsibility for the crimes. Heavy drinking had unquestionably been a recurring feature of Speck's life for many years, and evidence showed that he had consumed large amounts of alcohol on the day of the murders. Nevertheless, the prosecution argued that intoxication did not prevent him from making deliberate decisions throughout the night. They pointed to the sequence of events. Speck armed himself before approaching the townhouse, entered the residence, demanded money, restrained the victims, removed them individually rather than attacking everyone at once, and remained in control of the situation for several hours. According to the prosecution, these actions demonstrated planning and purposeful conduct rather than an inability to understand the nature of his behavior. The prosecution further argued that nothing in the evidence suggested Speck had lost awareness of his actions during the crimes. Instead, his repeated movements between the floors of the house, his efforts to keep the victims separated, and his departure from the residence before morning all reflected conscious decision-making. Consequently, prosecutors maintained that neither alcohol nor claims regarding mental condition eliminated his criminal responsibility. After hearing the testimony, examining the physical evidence, and considering the arguments presented by both sides, the jury began its deliberations. Despite the complexity of the investigation and the enormous public attention surrounding the case, the jurors reached their decision relatively quickly. According to the historical record, they required less than 2 hours to return a verdict. Richard Benjamin Speck was found guilty of murder. The verdict represented the culmination of months of investigative work and courtroom proceedings. It also reflected the strength of the combined evidence presented during the trial. Corazon Amureo's testimony, the fingerprint evidence, the recovered property, the forensic findings, and the investigative reconstruction of the crimes had persuaded the jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Following the guilty verdict, the court imposed the death penalty, which at that time remained an available sentence under Illinois law. For the families of the victims, no sentence could restore the lives that had been lost. Yet the verdict confirmed that the legal system had identified and convicted the man responsible. The trial itself also reinforced several important principles of criminal justice. It demonstrated the value of careful forensic investigation, the importance of preserving physical evidence, and the extraordinary impact a surviving eyewitness can have when supported by independent proof. Above all, it highlighted the courage of Corazon Amureo, whose ability to remain hidden throughout the night and later provide investigators with an accurate description of the intruder proved indispensable from the earliest stages of the investigation through the final moments of the trial. Yet although the jury's decision appeared to bring the legal proceedings to a close, the story of Richard Speck's punishment would not end with the sentence announced in 1967. Several years later, a landmark decision by the Supreme Court of the United States would reshape the legal landscape surrounding capital punishment, fundamentally changing Speck's sentence and ensuring that the remainder of his life would be spent not on death row, but behind prison walls. After Richard Benjamin Speck was convicted in April 1967 and sentenced to death, many believe that the legal conclusion of one of the most shocking criminal cases in American history had been reached. The evidence presented during the trial had convinced the jury that Speck was responsible for the murders of 8 student nurses inside the South Chicago townhouse. The verdict reflected the strength of the prosecution's case, which had been built upon the testimony of the sole survivor, Corazon Amureo, combined with physical evidence connecting Speck directly to the crime scene. However, the sentence imposed by the court would not remain unchanged. The broader American legal system was entering a period of significant transformation, particularly regarding the use of capital punishment. Several years after Speck's conviction, a major Supreme Court decision would affect death sentences across the country, including Speck's. In 1972, the Supreme Court of the United States issued its decision in the case of Furman v. Georgia. The ruling resulted in the suspension or reversal of many death sentences throughout the United States because of concerns surrounding the application of capital punishment at that time. As a consequence of this legal shift, Richard Speck's death sentence was changed to life imprisonment. The decision did not alter the facts of the case, the evidence presented at trial, or the jury's original conclusion regarding his responsibility for the murders. Instead, it changed the punishment that could legally be carried out. Speck, who had once faced execution, would instead spend the remainder of his life incarcerated within the Illinois prison system. For the families of the victims, the change in sentence represented another difficult moment connected to a tragedy that had already caused unimaginable loss. The legal system had confirmed Speck's guilt, but the sentence modification meant that the punishment would not take the form many had expected after the original trial. The case therefore continued to be discussed not only because of the murders themselves, but also because of the broader questions surrounding justice, punishment, and the purpose of the criminal justice system. Following the change in his sentence, Speck remained imprisoned in Illinois. Unlike many criminal cases that fade from public attention after a conviction, the Speck case continued to attract interest because of the severity of the crimes and the disturbing details surrounding them. The murders had already become one of the most significant examples of mass violence in 20th century America, and Speck himself remained a figure of public fascination and condemnation. However, the focus of the case gradually shifted. The trial had centered on proving what happened inside the townhouse. The later years focused more on the consequences of the conviction and the question of how society should respond to someone responsible for such extreme violence. Throughout his imprisonment, Speck remained a controversial figure. The available information indicates that he eventually became the subject of further public controversy decades after his conviction. In 1996, a secretly recorded prison video was released, showing Speck engaging in behavior that shocked many observers. The footage showed him using drugs, interacting with other prisoners, and making statements about the murders. The release of this recording created renewed public anger and reopened discussions about Speck's attitude toward his crimes, the conditions inside prisons, and the effectiveness of prison management. For many people who followed the case, the footage was disturbing because it appeared to reveal a lack of remorse. The reaction was especially strong because the public memory of the crime remained closely connected to the lives of the 8 young women who had been killed. Their identities and futures had been permanently cut short, while Speck had continued living inside the prison system for decades. The video therefore created a new wave of attention around a case that had already occupied a significant place in American criminal history. However, even as discussions focused on Speck's behavior years later, the central tragedy remained the loss of the victims. The women killed in the townhouse were not simply names connected to a famous crime. They were young student nurses with families, friendships, and ambitions. Their lives had been dedicated to training for a profession centered on helping others. The violence that ended their lives transformed them from private individuals into figures remembered through one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. The case also continued to highlight the extraordinary survival of Corazon Amureo. Her experience represented one of the most remarkable aspects of the investigation. While the crime itself was defined by the loss of 8 lives, the fact that one person survived created the possibility of justice. Her actions during the night were not the result of any special advantage or protection. She survived because she recognized danger, made a critical decision at the right moment, found a hiding place, and remained silent despite overwhelming fear. Afterward, she carried the burden of describing what had happened inside the house. Her testimony provided investigators with the information necessary to identify and arrest Speck. The importance of her role extended beyond the courtroom. The case became an example frequently referenced in discussions of criminal investigations because it demonstrated how a surviving witness can become the key connection between a crime scene and a suspect. Without Corazone's account, investigators would have faced a far more difficult task. The physical evidence was significant, but her description of the attacker provided the first direct path toward identifying him. The tattoo on Speck's arm, the detail she remembered, became a crucial clue that linked him to the investigation. Beyond the investigation and trial, the murders produced lasting changes in discussions about safety and security. The attack occurred in a residence where student nurses lived while working and training at a hospital. The fact that such violence could occur in what many considered an ordinary living environment created widespread concern. Hospitals and institutions across the country began paying greater attention to security procedures in housing used by students and medical workers. Measures such as stronger door security, greater control over access, and improved emergency procedures became increasingly emphasized. The case demonstrated that safety concerns could exist even in places previously considered secure. The tragedy also influenced public conversations about violent crime in America during the 1960s. At a time when many communities were already experiencing concerns about crime rates and social change, the Speck murders became one of the events that shaped public fear and awareness. The crime represented a form of violence that was difficult for many people to understand, an apparently random attack against individuals who had no personal connection to the offender. The lack of a clear personal motive made the case even more unsettling. According to the available information, Speck's initial intention was robbery. But the situation escalated into a prolonged attack without a personal relationship between the offender and the victims. That absence of a clear explanation became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Richard Speck remained imprisoned until his death on December 5, 1991. He died in prison from a heart attack at the age of 50. His death marked the final chapter of the legal story surrounding the man convicted of one of Illinois' most infamous crimes. Yet his death did not erase the impact of what occurred in July 1966. The case continued to be studied, discussed, and remembered because of the questions it raised about violence, criminal responsibility, survivor testimony, and the ability of law enforcement to bring a perpetrator to justice. Looking back, the Richard Speck murders remain significant not because of the notoriety of the offender, but because of the lives lost and the remarkable courage displayed by the person who survived. The 8 student nurses who died were remembered through their identities, their work, and the futures they never had the opportunity to experience. Corazon Amureo's survival ensured that the truth of what happened inside the townhouse could be uncovered. Her testimony transformed a horrifying crime scene into a case that investigators could solve and prosecutors could prove in court. Decades later, the details of the case remain painful. But the lasting lesson is not about the man who committed the murders. It is about the importance of remembering the victims, recognizing the courage of survivors, and understanding how justice depends on evidence, persistence, and the willingness of people to tell the truth even after experiencing unimaginable trauma. The story of Richard Benjamin Speck and the murders committed in South Chicago in July 1966 remains one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. More than half a century later, the details continue to be studied not because of the identity of the man responsible, but because of the profound impact the crime had on the victims' families, the medical community, criminal investigations, and public understanding of violent crime. The events that unfolded inside the townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street were not simply a case of murder. They represented a moment when an ordinary residence became the location of an unimaginable tragedy, when 8 young women lost their lives, and when one survivor's courage became the central force that allowed justice to be pursued. On the night of July 13, 1966, the women living in that house were not expecting danger. They were student nurses building their futures through hard work and dedication. They returned from hospital duties, rested after demanding schedules, and lived together in a home provided for those training in the medical profession. Their lives were defined by ordinary routines and professional ambitions. They were preparing to care for others, unaware that they themselves would soon become victims of one of the most notorious crimes of the 20th century. The tragedy of the case is not only found in the violence that occurred, but also in the fact that the victims had no connection to the person who attacked them. Richard Speck did not target them because of a personal conflict or a previous relationship. According to the available information, he entered the house initially intending to commit robbery. The women inside were strangers to him. Their paths crossed by chance, and that random encounter resulted in a devastating loss of life. This absence of a personal motive became one of the most unsettling elements of the case. It forced investigators and the public to confront a frightening reality. Extreme violence could occur without warning, even against people who had done nothing to provoke it. The investigation that followed demonstrated the importance of both physical evidence and human courage. When police arrived at the townhouse after Corazon Amureo escaped and alerted neighbors, they discovered a scene that shocked even experienced investigators. 8 women had been killed inside the residence. The crime required careful examination, not only to determine what had happened, but also to identify the person responsible. At the beginning of the investigation, authorities faced the enormous challenge of finding a suspect. There was no immediate identification of the attacker, no known relationship between him and the victims, and no obvious reason explaining why the women had been targeted. The breakthrough came through the survival and testimony of Corazon Amureo. Her survival was extraordinary, but equally important was her ability to provide investigators with accurate information despite the unimaginable trauma she had experienced. She remembered details about the attacker's appearance, his voice, and his tattoos. These observations became the foundation of the search for the suspect. Her description of the tattoo on his arm, particularly the phrase, "born to raise hell," became a crucial identifying feature. Within days, that detail helped connect investigators to Richard Speck. The discovery of Speck at a hospital after his failed suicide attempt demonstrated how quickly the investigation progressed. A doctor recognized the tattoo described by Corazon, and law enforcement was notified. Speck was arrested while receiving medical treatment. The arrest represented a turning point, but the prosecution still needed to prove that the man in custody was responsible for the crimes. The eventual case against Speck was built through a combination of evidence. Corazon's identification was supported by fingerprints recovered from the crime scene. Property belonging to the victims was found in Speck's possession. Investigators recovered a knife consistent with the injuries suffered by the victims, and blood-stained clothing provided additional evidence connecting him to the murders. Each piece of information strengthened the others. The prosecution did not depend solely on memory or assumption. Instead, it presented a complete picture showing that Speck had entered the townhouse, controlled the victims, committed the murders, and then attempted to avoid responsibility. During the trial, the prosecution emphasized the sequence of events. The evidence showed that Speck had entered the residence armed with a handgun and knife. He had demanded money, restrained the women, and maintained control of the situation for several hours. The murders were not presented as a single moment of uncontrolled violence, but as a prolonged series of actions in which victims were separated individually. This distinction was central to the prosecution's argument that Speck understood what he was doing and should be held fully responsible. The defense attempted to argue that Speck's alcohol use and mental condition affected his responsibility. However, the jury ultimately rejected those arguments. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached a guilty verdict in less than 2 hours. Speck was sentenced to death, but that sentence was later changed to life imprisonment following the Supreme Court decision in Furman v. Georgia in 1972. The change in sentence became part of the broader national debate about capital punishment, but it did not change the conclusion reached by the trial jury. Richard Speck was responsible for the deaths of 8 women. The later years of Speck's imprisonment brought additional controversy. The release of a secretly recorded prison video in 1996 created renewed public anger. The footage showed Speck engaging in behavior that caused widespread criticism and led many people to question his attitude toward the crimes he had committed. However, even during these later controversies, the central focus of the case remained the victims and the impact of their loss. The 8 women killed in the townhouse were remembered not for the circumstances of their deaths, but for the lives they represented before that night. They were daughters, friends, colleagues, and aspiring nurses. Their futures were interrupted while they were preparing for careers dedicated to helping others. Remembering them requires looking beyond the crime itself and recognizing the individuals whose lives were taken. The case also left a lasting influence on security practices. The attack changed how many institutions considered the safety of student housing and medical facilities. Hospitals and organizations became more aware of the need for stronger security measures, including better control of access, improved locks, and emergency procedures. The tragedy demonstrated that environments associated with care and education still required protection against unexpected threats. In criminal investigation history, the Speck case remains an important example of how a surviving witness can influence the outcome of a major investigation. Corazon Amureo's actions represented one of the most significant moments in the case. She survived not through chance alone, but through awareness, decision-making, and extraordinary endurance. She recognized the danger, found a hiding place, remained silent for hours, and then provided investigators with the information they needed. Her testimony connected the crime scene to the suspect and transformed an investigation that could have remained uncertain into a case that resulted in conviction. Richard Speck died in prison on December 5, 1991, from a heart attack. His death ended the life of the man convicted of one of America's most infamous mass murders. But it did not end the significance of the case. The story remains a reminder of the devastating consequences of violence and the importance of seeking justice for victims. Ultimately, the legacy of the Richard Speck murders should not belong to the person who committed them. It should belong to the 8 women whose lives were taken, to the families who endured their loss, and to the survivor whose courage allowed the truth to emerge. The events of that summer night in 1966 remain painful to remember, but remembering is essential. It ensures that the victims are not reduced to names in a criminal case file, but are recognized as real people whose lives mattered long before tragedy entered their home. The case stands as a reminder that behind every investigation are human beings, and that justice begins with preserving their stories.